see how clearly you're identifying the three categories of individuals who reject the invitation. First of all, which group over here? Which group did you see here as being guilty of rejecting the invitation? How would you describe that group? They were unwilling, all right? We have a group who were just plain unwilling. Let's write it up here. They were unwilling to accept the invitation. In fact, that's exactly what my version says, that they were unwilling to come when they received the invitation. Then we have a second category of individuals in here, a second category of individuals who were not just unwilling, but we'd have to categorize them a little differently, yes. They made fun, all right, but they had one thing in common. What was it? Unbelief? They went to work, so how would you, putting together everything that individuals in this category did, what is the common element here? Too busy, yes. They were indifferent. They were indifferent. All right, but they all had one thing in common. I'm not hearing it coming through loud and clear yet. They wouldn't pay any attention. No, they didn't just ignore it at all. That's not what they did. The first group here ignored it. They were unwilling to even consider this invitation, but the second group did not do that. They did respond in a certain way. You've moved a little further ahead now. I'm not sure we're in this center group yet. They made light of it by doing what? Earl, yes? They substitute. What did they say, for example? What did one of them say? What did one of them say? Yes, I've got to go and look at my land. I don't know whether the land was planning to change overnight or not. He had to go and look at his land. What did somebody else say? Yes, anybody else? Got to go and look at my oxen because I'm preparing for a wedding. What are you hearing coming through here? Yeah, you're interpreting now. I'm just looking simply at what they were doing. Indeed they were, yes. These people had reasons. They made excuses. They were not just indifferent at all. They made excuses why they couldn't respond to the invitation, and they had some rather interesting excuses. In fact, in another place in the New Testament, one says, I've got married, and used that as his excuse for not responding to the invitation. We'll come back to that in just a moment. The third category over here. Pardon? Well, how did they respond to the invitation? What would you say? They were what? They were hostile. They responded with what? Yes, indeed. This group responded with violence. They actually responded with violence to the invitation. I want you to look at the extremes that we have here in terms of responses now to the invitation. These are all individuals who ultimately rejected the invitation. One group were just absolutely wanting nothing to do with that invitation. They were not even attracted by it. They were just plain unwilling to come. The second group, well, they had some rather interesting reasons why they couldn't come. One was in business, one had to look at his land, one was getting ready for a wedding. There were various excuses being brought forward as to why they couldn't respond to the invitation. But the third group, I guess you could say, was offended by the invitation. They were so offended by it that they responded with violence. They actually attacked the servants of the king who came to bring them the invitation. We know, of course, historically, that all those who rejected the invitation at that time could be categorized as which group of individuals? Pardon? Yes, we are looking at the Jewish nation originally, but the meaning goes much deeper than just the Jews to the Gentiles. We're looking here at a possible application to ourselves. Now, I want you to consider this very carefully now. Each of these individuals made the same mistake in principle in rejecting the invitation. And I want you to have a little discussion in your group this morning and see if you can identify what the common element or mistake was on the part of each of these three groups of individuals. What's the common thread between them that led them, obviously, to reject this particular invitation? You've got 2 minutes to talk that over. What is the common thread between them that led them to reject this particular invitation? Please communicate. It's a very serious question. If you see it, the parable will start to unravel before us. Back over here, that was the first hand up, so we'll give her the first chance now to give us an insight. Okay. Common thread was that they were self-seekers. Yes, I think I could buy that. It's hovering around first base now. But let's see if we can go beyond that or not. There's no question that there's a self element here. Yes. They didn't feel honored to be in the presence of the king. Okay? I think we're getting off first base now and we're starting to move a little. Yes?
In verse 8 it says, the king was enraged, he sent his army to the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited
Those I invited did not deserve to come. They didn't deserve to come. That's a very interesting observation, and that's right out of the parable itself. They didn't deserve to come. Can we elaborate on this? Yes.
They had been invited.
Yes. They had been invited. Yes, okay. They'd been invited. None of them appreciated. What do you mean by that, appreciated the invitation? Spell that out for us. Here's a golden opportunity for you now. They didn't value all that highly what was being offered to them. I like that very much. They didn't value it highly. What evidence is there that they didn't value it too highly? Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. This group wouldn't even give the time of day to the messenger. Don't bother me with something like that. This group read the invitation, but they came up with the most incredible excuses. The busyness of life. What an excuse that is. Too busy to accept an invitation of this nature. Another group said, well, it's my material possessions. I have to take care of my land, my business, whatever it is. Material possessions were looming very large in their thinking. And so they gave as an excuse a reason based upon material things. Think about it. And they were turning down what? Yes, indeed. There are many today, by the way, who would give a similar excuse. In fact, I think it could be very inconvenient for Jesus to come at the moment with a number of people because they are so concerned about the pursuit of material things that Jesus coming could actually be an inconvenience. Don't miss this, will you? So the best thing that's come through this morning so far is they didn't appreciate the invitation. We need to go one step further than that. We're on second base now. If you're failing to appreciate the invitation, a failure to appreciate the invitation is rooted in something else. And that's why you can be easily swayed from accepting the invitation. You may, in fact, even respond with violence. With violence. The failure to appreciate the invitation is rooted in a failure to appreciate the one who was extending the invitation. How interesting. How interesting. Yes. Yes, but don't miss this point that's coming through here. It was the failure to appreciate the one who was extending the invitation. We need to take that one more step. Keep in mind, by the way, I received one day an invitation from the White House to dinner. What do you think I did with it? I threw it in the trash can. I saw the official seal on the outside of the letter, and I was very excited to get this invitation. Very excited. I'll tell you a little more about that invitation when we come over to here, because the invitation stipulated that if I was going to accept the invitation, I must wear a certain type of dress. I had to be dressed a certain way in order to respond to the invitation. It was required of me to dress a certain way. If you fail to appreciate the one who is extending the invitation, yes? Well, yes, that's built in here as well, a failure to appreciate his messengers as well. They had no respect for him. We're getting closer now. Yes, you're interpreting again over here. Pardon? They didn't know him. That's an interesting comment. They didn't know him, yes? All right, if they didn't know him, they what? They wouldn't prepare. Okay, and behind you there? They didn't know him, it means they didn't love him. All right, it's a valid comment. Yes, the lady back here? They were self-satisfied. They felt no need. What were they actually choosing? Don't call out now. What were they actually choosing by rejecting this invitation? Think about it for a moment. That in their haste to reject this invitation, they were actually making an incredible choice. You have 1 minute to talk that over. What choice were they engaged in making by rejecting this invitation? Brave lady back here. This is a deep question I've raised now, a very deep question. Let's hear your response. They rejected the opportunity to live. Why do you say that? So what were they failing to comprehend all along? Come on, don't leave me hanging here now. I agree with you. They had rejected life. And they were actually choosing death because they had failed to recognize something. What was it? Down here. The final decision. Listen, please. Shh, shh. We can't hear you, I'm sorry. So what had they failed to see? By accepting or wanting worldly riches instead of eternal riches, what were they failing to comprehend? It's the bottom line now, right at the back. Not just his authority, what they were being invited to, his royalty, what he could do for them, the value of the author. We're very good at circling the issue here, circling it very nicely. Let's hit it now, right on the head, over here. The love of the King. Well, what are you telling me in principle? What had they failed to take into account? Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. You and your husband doing pretty well here this morning. We could get a little group going here. They didn't hear you, though, unfortunately. Yes, indeed. They failed to take into account the character of the one who was extending the invitation. His character is now on the line. And we're about to get a much closer look at the character of this king, aren't we? A much closer look. What was it costing them all, by the way, to respond to this invitation? A little bit of time, perhaps, yes. Give up their own business and activities for a brief period of time to respond to the invitation. But they failed to take into account the character of the one who was extending the invitation. You cannot treat the king with indifference. You cannot be more preoccupied with your own activities and devalue his. And you certainly cannot, through violence, indicate to this king that you are the master of your own destiny. You can't do that, because the invitation was being extended in love. And the rejectors of love are in the business of choosing force and violence, and ultimately, of course, death. If you reject the love invitation of this king, you are actually in process of choosing who? Satan. Oh, yes. Because what this king is holding out to you is rooted in love. And to reject that love is to respond to that which is not rooted in love. Force and violence and ultimately death. What an issue is at stake here. To fail to read the character of the one who is extending the invitation. And I've got serious news for every one of you this morning. There are many in the church today who are trifling with the invitation. I mean trifling so seriously with the invitation, but they are failing to take into account the character of the one they are trifling with and the serious consequences of trifling with eternal realities. And let's look at the other side of this ledger here and see how serious the consequences are. There are two groups of individuals who accepted or responded to the invitation. Who are they? Very simple question. Who are they? Pardon? Yes, both good and bad responded to this invitation. And they can be further grouped by what distinction between them? Back there? Worthy and unworthy. Looking at the parable itself, though, what further distinction becomes apparent? Obedient, disobedient, these are all good terms, but give me the parable now. What was the distinguishing factor? Of course, yes. One chose to put on a wedding garment, and one had no wedding garment. Let's look at it now. And by the way, the custom in those days was, I wish it was a custom today, that when you received an invitation to a wedding of this kind, the host provided you with the garment that you would wear for the occasion. When I received my invitation to the White House, a tuxedo was required. Now, unfortunately, I don't own a tuxedo. So I had to go out and rent one for the occasion, but I was delighted to go and rent a tuxedo for the privilege of sitting down to dinner with the President of the United States. Who wouldn't go out and rent a tuxedo for an occasion like that? Would you go and rent a tuxedo? I'm overwhelmed here. I didn't waste any time. The next day I went out and I started looking around. There are several little shops around where I live that all rent that kind of clothing, because I wanted to be appropriately dressed, because the invitation stated very clearly, this is a black tie occasion, which means that you will be wearing a tuxedo. And I didn't want to be the one who turned up at the White House looking different from everybody else. In other words, if you respond to the invitation, that indicates a willingness on your part to come dressed appropriately for the occasion. Now, don't miss this morning, will you? There's an individual in this parable who actually responded to the invitation. The fact that this individual responded to the invitation tells you what about this person? What do we know about this person by virtue of the fact they are responding to the invitation? He appreciates the gift. That statement may be subject to question in just a moment. What was the evidence here? What was the evidence that you appreciated the invitation? What was the evidence in the parable that you appreciated the invitation? Yes, indeed. I'm waiting for it. What was the evidence that I appreciated the invitation to the White House? Oh, yes. What was it?
Well, what the implication of that question is that we can have two struggling counter-desires. We can have a desire for Christ, and we can have a counter-desire, can we not? Can there not be a battle in our lives?
It's possible to have a battle, but don't miss what's happening in this parable, whatever you do. The great evidence in this parable that he appreciated the invitation was
that he entirely allowed God's kingdom to be dwelling in his life by virtue of
No, it's not coming through loud and clear yet. Over here. Yes, indeed. The great evidence in this parable that the invitation was appreciated was the willingness on the part of that individual to come dressed appropriately for the occasion. What then is built into? What is built into a willingness to respond to the invitation, but a failure to come dressed appropriately? There is something very significant now about to emerge. Now think about this for a moment. What is built into, on one hand, a willingness to come to the feast, but a refusal to wear the wedding garment? You have a minute to talk this over. It's the most crucial point in the parable. There are many who want to sit down at this feast, but only few who are willing to wear the wedding garment. Over here, okay? Yes. The wedding garment was provided. He felt that his own garment was good enough. All right, we're getting to first base now. You've got the ball rolling next to you there. The fire is spreading, yes? Pardon? Listen, please. He wanted to come on his own terms. A very interesting observation. He wanted to come on his own terms. Can we go further than that? Down here.
He wanted salvation, but not the character of Christ.
He wanted salvation, but not the character of Christ. Interesting observation. It was a question of obedience. Yes? Wasn't he openly rebelling against the king? Was the king concerned about the fact that somebody in there did not have a wedding garment on? When the king came in and he looked around, he said, "Friend, how come you're in here without a wedding garment?" And the man, what does it say there? Look at it carefully. He was speechless. Absolutely speechless. What are we learning about the king at this moment? Listen, please. Yes, you're interpreting now. We're getting into this interpretation pretty strongly here, and I'm just wondering what we're learning about the king at this moment. Pardon? There are conditions. There are conditions, huh? There are no conditions. We'll have a civil war here soon. All those conditions over here and no conditions over here. Yes. All right. So at the moment that this man decided to come into the feast without a wedding garment, what was he declaring attitudinally at that moment toward the king? Listen, please. He wanted to accept, but he didn't want to keep the law. Oh, we really need clarification now at this point, don't we? Yes. He didn't want to make a complete surrender to the will of the king. He didn't want to trust that the king knew best. And it's like somebody said before, this man assumed something about himself. What assumption was he basing on in coming to the king dressed as he was? He wanted the benefits of the palace without the association with the king. What assumption was he basing his appearance there on? Yes. Behind you there. Yes, I'm just looking for the simple facts now. He assumed that his own garments would be acceptable to the king. Oh yes, he made that assumption. But what a mistake it was, because he had failed to take into account something that these individuals had also failed to take into account. What was it? Don't call out, please.
It is not when we get to the wedding feast that the Lord will provide things, but that the practical lesson today is, for us, is that we today are wearing his garment, so that when we go in, we'll already...
What did they fail to take into account? What did he fail to take into account that these people also failed to take into account? The very character of the one who was extending this invitation. Let's pull this together. What do you notice then about both the invitation and the wedding garment? What's the common element between the invitation and the wedding garment? They're both necessary. They are both gifts. Yes, indeed. Don't miss that, will you? Both the invitation and the wedding garment are free. They are both gifts from the King. But there's one basic difference between accepting a wedding garment and accepting an invitation. There is one basic difference between accepting an invitation on one hand and receiving a wedding garment on the other. I thought every lady here would see that issue very, very quickly. One basic difference between accepting an invitation and accepting a wedding garment. You're giving up self. You're not pointing to the difference between accepting an invitation and accepting a wedding garment. Oh, very good, yes. Very good observation. Excellent observation. Did you all hear what he said? Stand up and evangelize, please, this morning. That was so good we can handle hearing it a little more evangelistically. If you stand up, they'll hear you over here. Incredible observation. We're looking here with the acceptance of the invitation. We are looking at imputed righteousness. The acceptance of that which God is offering you through Jesus Christ. We've already talked about it 2 days in a row. The privilege of being declared righteous on the basis of what Jesus has done in your place. So the acceptance of the invitation, imputed righteousness, but the putting on of the wedding garment, an invitation you just receive, a wedding garment you wear, you put it on. The wedding garment, moving us now into the beautiful area of imparted righteousness, the sanctified and holy life. And both the invitation and the wedding garment are gifts from the King. What a tragedy that some people fail to really appreciate the invitation. Now listen to this statement very carefully. Only those who truly appreciate the invitation that God is extending to them have the privilege of wearing the wedding garment. Don't miss that, will you? Only those who truly appreciate the invitation have the privilege of wearing the wedding garment. In other words, if you have let Jesus love you enough to save you, to declare you righteous on the basis of his death in your place, God will now develop within you his own beautiful character. Do you believe it? But it's only given to those who are not looking at self, but have their eyes on the cross of Calvary. The average person that I meet today who is hung up on salvation issues is not looking at the invitation. Their eyes are focused on the garment. They are looking at their own human performance. You know what Ellen White says about that garment, don't you? In Christ's Object Lessons, the wedding garment, she says, has within it not one thread of human devising. It's not you getting better. It is God in you bringing about the most beautiful character development in the lives of those who truly appreciate what is done for them in Christ Jesus. How many times have I uncomfortably sat in meetings? I've even seen people draw little diagrams like this. I heard somebody say once, sanctification is like this. In the beginning, it's all Christ. But as you grow and get better and stronger and become holier, you need less of him because now you've got all this righteousness yourself. I've got news for you. As we said yesterday, it's Jesus the whole way. You will never be more perfect than when you're justified. Do you believe that? You have the perfection of God credited to you. And if you're trusting in God and his righteousness to save you, he will then develop within you all that you need to enjoy eternity with him. I praise God every day that I am not saved on the basis of how good I am, but on the basis of how good he was in my place. It's God's business to clothe me in that wedding garment. I'm not growing to the point where I need less of the righteousness of Jesus because I now have more of my own. What a fatal philosophy that is. Who is there sitting among us this morning who realizes just how fatal that philosophy is? Because that kind of thinking could be equated with what in our parable this morning? Think very carefully before you speak now. That kind of thinking I just described could be equated with something in our parable this morning. What is it? I have failed you all miserably this morning. Oh yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It could be equated with a failure to appreciate the invitation. The only people who start heading on that narrow path of perfection, striving every day until finally one day they hope to be able to say, "Look at me, I have spent a day without sin." Those who do it have failed to appreciate the invitation. They have not seen what God is offering them in Christ Jesus. And because of a failure to see it, they will spend their lives in agony, trying to demonstrate to God that which God has already provided, free of cost, at great sacrifice to himself, in love, willing to declare you righteous, not on the basis of something that you have done, but on the basis of that which has been done for you. What's it saying to you this morning? What's it saying? If you want the robe of righteousness, the way to get it is not to narrow your lifestyle until hopefully one day you can say, "I think I've made it through today." The way to receive the wedding garment is to put your focus where these individuals failed to put theirs. Put it where? On the cross of Calvary, and see what God in human flesh has done for you. With your eyes there, believe me, you will not only have the wedding garment, you'll have the privilege of sitting down and enjoying a feast, celebrating this incredible marriage. Isn't our God good? What a God we have.